Thought that would be easier to do in a robe than it was. No one's really sure how it started. Did otherwise secular, non-religiously observant Jews have a sense of historical consciousness that precluded driving cars on Yom Kippur? Were they worried about offending a pious neighbor? Was it just how they had been raised? Whatever the original reason may have been, Israelis have long refrained from driving a car on Yom Kippur. The opportunity presented by carless streets was not lost on Israeli children, write statistician Shmuel Rosner and Camille Fuchs, who took to their bicycles each year in even greater numbers. After a decade, the phenomenon was keenly felt. After 2 decades, it was not just inconsiderate, but dangerous to drive a car on Yom Kippur. The streets were absolutely packed with children on bicycles. And they aren't exaggerating. Some 43% of Israeli parents say their kids ride bikes on Yom Kippur. And 1 in 10 Israeli adults, hundreds of thousands of adults, say that, quote, Yom Kippur is an ideal day to ride a bicycle. And they do so themselves. Adults who don't even own bicycles make plans to rent or to borrow them for the express purpose of riding a bicycle on Yom Kippur, just as I have done today. Sadly, it's not mine. It begs the question, is riding a bicycle on Yom Kippur a specifically Jewish act? As you might imagine, the rabbinate thinks not. As early as the mid-1980s, rabbis started putting out a call for, quote, children not to roam the streets on bicycles, which is forbidden on this holiest day. Rabbi Shmuel Holstein, writing specifically about this phenomenon, says this day is suitable for prayer and introspection. It is not suitable for cycling, which adds another sin to the holy day itself. Fasting, praying in synagogue, repenting your transgressions? Yes. Riding a bicycle, cruising the highways on a 2-wheeler? Decidedly no. And pretty close to 1/3 of all Israelis couldn't care less. They dust off, they rent or borrow a bicycle specifically for this one day of the year, to be with their Jewish family and friends, regardless of what the rabbis think. While Pew has not yet developed the right question to ask about Yom Kippur cycling as a measure for one's Jewishness on the next population study, it seems many Israeli Jews would say that this is their observance of Yom Kippur. After the destruction of the ancient temple, they might say, Yom Kippur was an important date in search of new content. Gone are the priests and the sacrifices and the blood. The rabbis suggest prayer and fasting in synagogues. We Israelis suggest the contemplative silence that comes from a societal pause and the hope for the future that is rekindled by seeing kids on bicycles. So, who's right? The rabbis or the Jews? Is riding a bicycle on Yom Kippur Jewish? Let's try to answer this question about what's uniquely Jewish in the most Jewish way possible by looking back at our history to find some clues. We should probably begin some 1,800 years ago. In a text ostensibly written to preserve memories and rituals of what was practiced in the temple, we read about the first fruit offerings brought to Jerusalem. Those bringing their fruits would load up a basket. They would parade into town with flute music before them and a bedazzled, gold-crowned ox. And they arrived at the ancient temple, they would proclaim 8 verses from the book of Deuteronomy, recalling God's kindness to their ancestors and bringing them from Egypt and into the promised land. Those who knew the verses would say them. Those who didn't know the verses would repeat after the priests. They would unload their baskets, pay their tax, and be on their way, which apparently worked pretty well, right up until it didn't. The Mishnah records that the people were tired of being embarrassed by their peers. Did you notice that Shlomo had to repeat after the priest? He didn't know the verse. And they stopped bringing their fruits altogether. The ancient priests, precursor to the rabbis, had a problem. Jewish ritual, as they preferred to observe it, bring us your first fruits and praise God through this de facto Jewish knowledge quiz about Bible, was actually pushing the Jewish community away. The priests could keep doing it their way, catering to a diminishing subset of the Jewish people, or they could read the writing on the wall. Spoiler alert, we're all still here, so they chose a different path. Hitkinu sheyu machrin et mi sheyodea ve'et mi she'eno yodea. The priests declared that everyone had to repeat after them, whether they knew the verse or not. Come one, come all, no one is going to be made to feel less than. The Jews had pushed back against a status quo that was no longer serving them. It was actually embarrassing them. And the leaders recognized that it was time to change in the interest of preserving Jewish continuity. But Rabbi, the Mishnah is ancient history, our high school students tell me every Sunday. Doesn't Judaism have anything slightly more recent to say about this? Of course it does. Thank you for asking. Let's fast forward some 1,600 years to antebellum Charleston, South Carolina. Why Charleston? In 1824, it was home to the largest Jewish population in the United States. And Kahal Kadosh Beth Elohim was the biggest synagogue in the country. Comprised of mainly Spanish and Portuguese Jews of the Sephardic Rite, their board meetings must have been a true sight to behold. In 1824, 47 congregants, led by Aaron Phillips and Isaac Harvey and Abraham Moise, submitted a petition to the Board of Trustees. Your services are long, they're pretty boring, and we don't even understand what you're saying, the petitioners wrote. Please change things while there are any Jews in the pews left to care about what you're doing. Okay, they were a bit more diplomatic about it. We all know the language of the time from the musical Hamilton. The memorial of the undersigned showeth unto your honorable body, and that's honorable with a U, of course, that they have witnessed with deep regret the apathy and neglect which have been manifested toward our holy religion. We would call the particular attention of your honorable body, again with the U, to the absolute necessity of abridging the service generally, and to repeat in English, that being the language of the country, such parts of the Hebrew prayers as may be deemed necessary. The rabbi and the president of the board had a problem. Jewish ritual, as they preferred to observe it, Hebrew and Ladino, and auctioning off honors and spitting on the floor, was actually pushing Jews away. They could keep doing it their way, catering to a diminishing subset of the Jewish population, or they could read the writing on the wall. This time, the president and the congregational rabbi chose not to change, rejecting the petition on procedural grounds. And the petitioners, well, they went off and formed their own synagogue. 14 years later, Kahal Kadosh Beth Elohim burned to the ground in the Great Charleston Fire of 1838. Which group do you suspect had the funds to rebuild? The rabbi and the board president, preservers of a status quo who only spoke Ladino and refused to change? Or the group that spoke English fluently and became successfully integrated into society? The Jews had to wait out their incalcitrant leadership, and then they brought about changes in the interest of preserving Judaism. But Rabbi, The 1800s are ancient history, our high school students tell me every Sunday. TikTok wasn't even invented then. Doesn't Judaism have anything more recent to say about this? It sure does. Thank you for asking. Before Temple Emmanuel made the transition to Mishkan HaNefesh, the silver and gold standards for the Reform Machzorim that you hold in your hands this day, we used gates of repentance. Do you remember this one? Before we made the transition to Mishkan Tefillah, the blue prayer book, we used every Shabbat, the gates of prayer. Do you remember this one or this one? And if you go far enough back in your memory banks, you remember flipping from the Amidah in the middle of the service to the back inside cover every time we stood together in prayer. Do you remember that moment? Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu v'Elohei Avotenu, the pages of the prayer book proclaim. Blessed are you, God, God of my fathers, God of Abraham, God of Isaac, God of Jacob. It's a beautiful prayer, but it unintentionally, hopefully, omits our relatively contemporary understanding that women are actually people too. Elohei Sarah, Elohei Rivka, Elohei Leah, Elohei Rachel. We posted on the back inside cover, God of Sarah, God of Rebecca, Rachel, and Leah, allowing our words of prayer to match our contemporary values. The editors of the prayer book, the rabbis, they had a problem. Jewish ritual, as they preferred to observe it, let's keep that Hebrew text intact and only change the English translation, was actually pushing away Jews who wanted that their core text reflect their highest values. The editor rabbis could keep doing it their way, catering to a diminishing subset of the Jewish people, or they could read the writing on the back inside cover. They heard the words of prayer coming from throughout the movement, and they integrated those words into the prayer book itself. The Jewish people had pushed back against a liturgy, against a status quo that was no longer serving them. It no longer matched their values. And the leaders recognized that it was high time to change in the interest of preserving community. You've caught on to the pattern by now. Abolishing traditions, changing traditions, renewing traditions, inventing traditions has always been necessary to ensure that what we think of as Jewish tradition continues to serve the Jews who practice it. It is as true 1,800 years ago as it was 200 years ago, as it is today. Jewish continuity has never been served by inflexible, rigid adherence to the way things have always been done. The Jewish people, they change. Our ritual practices have changed. And that change has always come as a reflection of the needs and wants and practices of the Jewish people, rather than their rabbis. You see and respond to the ways that Judaism is not working for you. You adapt, and eventually you, through a positive articulation of your values and through sustained effort, not only what you say, but what you do, you bring along rabbis and synagogues that have historically been slow to catch up. What if, write Rosner and Fuchs, a decline in synagogue attendance rates, along with simultaneous increase in cycling on Yom Kippur, did not signal a weakening commitment to Jewish culture, but simply a change in Jewish culture? What if the gradual and unrelenting decline in membership that Congregational President Michelle Markowitz mentioned during her address on Rosh Hashanah, not only at Temple Emmanuel, but in Reform and Conservative and even Orthodox synagogues across the country? What if they're not signs of apathy toward Judaism, but toward Jewish institutions that are no longer serving their Jewish people? What if the Jewish people are only pushing back against a status quo that is no longer serving them, as they have always done? The writing certainly seems to be on the wall. We have to find a different way. In the coming months, and if we play our cards right, the coming years, you will hear much more about these efforts. With the help of our strategic partners at Outside Angle, We're looking at your patterns and your preferences and the demographic projections of the South Hills. We're exploring the changing reality faced by American Jews and the best way to fund ongoing operations at Temple. We're going to be asking about your highest Jewish values in a study session immediately following this service, actually, because it is these values that have remained constant throughout Jewish history. How you put them into practice, what you need from your synagogue and rabbis, that's what we need to explore. We see that the status quo is unsustainable in the American synagogue writ large, that rabbis and Jewish leaders are relevant to a diminishing subset of the Jewish people, and we believe that Temple Emmanuel is well positioned to be part of the next evolution in Jewish life because of each of you. With your involvement, we are the center of progressive Jewish life in the South Hills. With your generosity, we remain financially sound. And with your creativity and passion and investment of heart and time and talents, we're ready to do what Jews have always done, from the days of the Mishnah to the age of TikTok. Adapt, change, and grow to meet the needs of you, the Jews who practice Jewish tradition. So, is riding a bicycle on Yom Kippur Jewish? Don't look at me. It's the Jews, not the rabbis, you, not me, who are going to be responsible for answering this question, just as it has always been. I think we're now ready to listen.